We'll now move to some remarks from Professor David Miller from the University of Bath. You have roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll go to some sort of discussion, hopefully, thereafter.
Sure. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you for inviting me here, Ibrahim and Asim. I'm David Miller from the University of Bath. I'm Professor of Sociology at the university, and I am, like every other public servant in this country, responsible for helping to prevent young people and old people being drawn into terrorism and political violence, according to the law. I'm also responsible, according to the law, for helping to promote equality amongst people at the university in relation to the selected protected characteristics of the Equality Act of 2010, one of which, of course, is religion. These two duties, which are placed upon me and every other public servant in the country, are contradictory. If I try and prevent people being drawn into terrorism in the way that the government wants me to do, as this report shows, I will, by definition, be discriminating against and undermining the possibility of equality between peoples on campus and off campus. So that gives you a sense, I think, of the legal quandary which all public servants find themselves in, even if they don't perhaps know that that's a quandary. But I wanted to suggest something else, which is about the way in which this process works to make people cautious and worried and concerned in a lot of different ways. And the example you just used about opticians, I think, is a very good example. The people who run this stuff, the PREVENT program and channel the referral process, talk about it as if it's not about hard policing, spying, breaches of civil liberties, but it's only about nice fluffy stuff, like, and the word they use is safeguarding. They want to safeguard children, like Asim's children, and make sure that they don't run risks. But of course, the difficulty with the whole way in which this process works is that it makes people, as the case of your wife shows, it makes people very, very worried about speaking to any public servant, about the possibility of showing any vulnerabilities. If you show any vulnerabilities, perhaps you're feeling sad or depressed or upset, or you're going through changes in your life, maybe you're speaking more, and sorry, this is an example of the PREVENT training given on the campus at the University of Bath, of signs to look for in terms of radicalisation. Students who speak more than normal are potentially becoming radical. Students who speak less than normal are potentially becoming radical. Students who don't come to class, students who go through changes, students who get tattoos, who change their clothing, who have some kind of signs of going through some kind of process of change in their lives. All of these are signs of radicalisation. So when I read these out to my students who take the course on terrorism at the University of Bath, I asked them how many of them these signs applied to. And of course, every single one of them, one of the signs applied to. So we're told to watch out for these signs of vulnerability, but of course that means that the possibilities of safeguarding people who genuinely are going through issues of mental health or changes in their life, the possibilities of those actually being properly addressed are made much, much worse by this process of hunting out radicals and extremists. And it doesn't just affect people who might be reported as radicals, but it affects everybody, because it creates a climate of suspicion and skepticism and worry all across public institutions, especially where these things are having a concrete impact. And one of the ways in which they're having a concrete impact in the universities is in relation to the new freedom of speech policies which have been adopted across all of the universities as a result of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which are by and large called freedom of speech policies, but are policies which are designed to ensure there is no freedom of speech on campus, since they are policies designed to exclude particular views and speakers from campus. Now, of course, these speakers are overwhelmingly and largely Muslim, but they're not only Muslim, unless I have converted recently. According to Douglas Murray of the Henry Jackson Society, I am an Islamist. I'm not quite sure how that could have been the case without my knowledge, but there we are. But I say this because, for example, I give you the example of a conference I was supposed to address in Huddersfield in July this year, which was cancelled at the last minute, and all of the speakers who had gone through the clearance process of the freedom of speech policy were told not to come to the conference because there was no conference on anymore. And the reason it was cancelled, we discovered through freedom of information requests to the university afterwards, was because the local regional PREVENT coordinator, that's a government official, was insisting on some fine details about who could chair particular sessions and how the chairs of those sessions was to respond to any expressions of views which were, and this is the wording of the Huddersfield policy, contrary to the fundamental values of our society. Not British values, but the fundamental values of our society, whatever they may be. So that's a process whereby I now have been stopped from speaking on the grounds that a government official didn't like the person who was chairing an event that I was going to go to. So that effectively means that I'm joining the esteemed ranks of Mozambique and others for having been banned from universities. Now, this is a story which could be told, but the point I want to make about that is that because of the way in which the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act operates, it means that universities are required, and all other public bodies, required to communicate with other bodies about their implementation of the Act and about who has been affected by the Act. So every university now in the country can effectively, through HEFGE, the higher education funded body, or potentially through the Home Office, find out who's been banned from a particular university or a particular speech. And of course, the first item on the criteria for deciding under the freedom of speech policies who should be banned or who shouldn't be banned is someone who's been banned somewhere else. So you can see that this kind of circular process spreads the web of suspicion further and further to people who are, first of all, not regarded as being extremists and then regarded as being extremists. And we move outwards and outwards until it becomes impossible to actually have any proper debate on campus, in the place in the country, in the society, which is supposed to be a forum for debate and for learning. And that's the way in which this process operates. So that's kind of the report's called The Science of Pre-Crime. This is the science of what happens after you bring in something like this pre-crime process, which I now wanted to go and talk about. And the connection is between what the remarks I've just made and the report here is again the question of the production of knowledge and debate in the universities. This report, as Asim has said, is secret. It's a report which we cannot see. Asim talks about the evidence base underlying this research, which of course is the interviews with 20 Muslim prisoners in British jails.
It was more than that in the end.
In the end, right. And essentially what they've done in this report, in the study that they did, was that they went and asked Muslims how they got involved in the process, which led them to be in prison. And as Asim said, of course, some of these are people who have been convicted under terrorism legislation, but who are not, even by the government's definition, terrorists. And I wanted to say a little bit about this, about the question of evidence base and how you go about studying political violence and the kinds of people who go about studying political violence and what kind of evidence base there is. And then the first thing I would say about this is that quite a lot of the research on terrorism that you get in academia isn't very good. Right? And that's because the whole question of what terrorism is a politically contested one. So the question of whether armed group X or armed group Y is a terrorist organization is a question of politics. The legislation in this country defines the roster of banned groups, of terrorist groups in this country, and the armed groups which are on that list are defined under the legislation as terrorists, and armed groups which are not on that list are not defined as terrorists. So, for example, the FARC in Colombia, not a terrorist organization according to the British government. But you know, when you actually start to break that down in terms of public debate or discussion, doesn't make any sense. Of course, state organizations, state groups are not defined as terrorists. The US government is not defined as a terrorist organization, and nor is the British government in UK legislation. So the evidence base that one gets in terrorism research is slight. I've been studying this for the last 2 or 3 years, looking at the way in which expertise is created in the universities. And I come across quite a number of examples where the same kind of reasoning as is used in this report has been made by people who've been regarded as terrorism experts in criminal trials, or indeed in the media. So one of the earliest examples I came across was a guy called Anthony Glees, who now works at the University of Buckingham, who wrote a report some almost 10 years ago now called When Students Turn to Terror. And he found, he got a list together of all the people who had been convicted of terrorism offences who in the previous part of their lives had gone to a UK university. And he advanced the proposition that because these people had gone to a UK university and had ended up as terrorists, it must be the universities which are causing them to become terrorists. And so he directed attention by the government and the intelligence agencies and several other think tanks towards the universities as being a hotbed of radicalisation, etc. And of course, it's the same argument that's made here. You find some reasons why some people got involved in offences which led to them being convicted of terrorism, and then you advance that those must be the reasons that have caused the involvement. And of course, it's ridiculous. You know, all of these terrorists in the Anthony Glees's report were, of course, at one point in their mother's womb. We don't, of course, as a result, say that women are responsible for terrorism. We might say that for other reasons, but we don't do that because it would be preposterous. But that's the level of the reasoning that you have in this report, the scientific reasoning. That's the kind of reasoning you get in terrorism trials. Perhaps the most famous rubbish terrorism expert that there is a guy called Evan Coleman, a guy who claims to have postgraduate qualifications, which he hasn't, claims to have his work peer-reviewed in scientific journals, which he doesn't, claims that his book was published by Oxford University Press, which it wasn't, etc. And he came up with the same kind of argument. He looks at cases of people who have been convicted of terrorism and says, well, look at what happened to them. Look, these people were all Muslims, so therefore there's some kind of relationship between Muslims, being Muslim and being a terrorist. And that's the kind of level of the argument that you have. This is not science, right? That's the first point I would make about it. The second point I would make is the question of the secret research. I don't want to talk about academia too much here because it's a bit boring, right? But if you actually want to produce evidence about a social phenomenon or indeed a natural phenomenon in science or in social science, you have to produce research where you do a study of evidence and you publish that study following a process of peer review, meaning that the study is sent anonymously to 2 or more reviewers who then anonymously fill in a report on it to say whether it's publishable or whether it needs to be revised. As we know, this study didn't go through any such process. It's not been properly peer reviewed. But you also, more importantly, have to make sure that the evidence that you produce or that you use is available for critique in the future by other scientists or social scientists. And that's very clear in all the ethical policies, for example, of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, perhaps the leading journal committee for ethical issues in medical science. And they make that very clear that there cannot be such a thing as secret research. The notion of secret research undermines the very possibility of being able to scrutinize the evidence base in the future. Now, if there is an evidence base underlying this research, if there are in existence transcripts of these interviews or a database which they used to cross-reference and cross-tabulate the statistics or whatever they produced, then we need to be able to see that. And not only that, the authors need to be able to say that they have seen and controlled all of the data. And what do I mean by that? Well, actually, given this is a secret report, we don't know what steps the Home Office or the National Offender Management Service took to alter or change or edit the findings before they were published in the non-published version that there is or in the published version, because it's secret research. We don't know what role the funding body, in this case the employers of the people who did it, we don't know what role they've had. And this is a more general problem in social research today, in the area of science, in particular with corporate influence, but in the area of particular social science, with the influence of security agencies in funding and managing science. So, for example, I work at the University of Bath, which is a partner in a research centre called CREST, the Centre for the Research of Extremism and Security Threats, which is based at Lancaster University, which is funded to the tune of, I think, £3 million, possibly slightly more, by organisations which have described themselves by the title the British intelligence agencies. So that's MI5, MI6, GCHQ, and the Centre for the Protection of Critical National Infrastructure, I think it's the other one. So this is a research centre at British universities, which is funded by the intelligence services, where some of the research is done under the terms of the Official Secrets Act. Some of the researchers involved have signed the Official Secrets Act. And so as a result of that, we'll have research where we do not know whether all the data has been released, whether the intelligence services have intervened in the research before it's published, and the contract stipulates that they're allowed to do that. And nor do we know the extent to which the research or parts of the research have been used by the intelligence agencies for particular purposes. Now, why is this important? It's important for the possibility of there being social science research not interfered with by the security and intelligence agencies. But when I tell you that some of the research that this organisation is doing is on, how do they describe it? On interview techniques in interrogation processes. You'll start to recognise pretty quickly that what we're talking about here is academic researchers at British universities engaged in secret research which relates to the possibility of mistreatment in interrogation. I think there's a word for that. It's called torture, isn't it? And of course, this is a similar process, as is highlighted at the beginning of this report, which has happened in the US, where the American Psychological Society went through all sorts of contortions when it became apparent that psychologists in the US had been involved in researching, indeed collaborating with American forces in the use of torture, and indeed in some cases participating in torture. So what we see here is that, and this is an example of it. It's not just an isolated example. This is part of a pattern of the way in which the researchers in government and in academia are involved with the security and intelligence services in a way which undermines the possibility of us actually discovering more about the questions we're supposed to be investigating, such as radicalization and extremism. Let me say something a little bit about that. Asim was quite polite, really, about radicalization as a concept. This is not a concept of any academic merit or worth. This is a concept which was invented by the security and intelligence establishment after 7/7 and the Madrid bombings, and was created by them and given to academics to go and research. There is no credible research on radicalization. The concept is entirely meaningless, and it's simply a concept used in order that they can erect the kind of nonsense that's evidenced in this report into legislation. Can try and suggest that the problem with terrorism is these Muslims get radical, and we need to find a way of understanding that and intervening in that. The problem with terrorism is absolutely not that there are Western foreign policy and domestic policy issues which actually. I remember I saw a meme on Facebook last week. Big surprise! Research finds when you bomb people, they don't like you very much. You know? I mean, this is like this is obvious, right? But in official academic parlance, you cannot say, that the reason that there is political violence in the world from powerless groups or from individuals or lone wolves or whatever they're called, the reason that this is there is because of the way in which predominantly Western, not only Western, predominantly Western foreign policy intervenes in countries around the world, most obviously in the last decade in Afghanistan and Iraq and to some extent now in Syria. So I think it's clear that the way in which one should understand political violence and terrorism is quite different from the way in which one is invited to understand it in reports like this. But I think this report does a valuable service in really shining a light into the way in which academia operates and the way in which that's then been used by government. So Asim wants us to focus on the government, and I'm with him on that. But let's have a little look at academia too, and the way in which the kind of corruption of secret research eats away at the fabric of the possibility of academics doing proper research. And I put that in the context of my remarks at the beginning, of the context of every university campus now supposed to be focusing on finding radicals on campus. And those two things together mean that life on campus is changing quite markedly, and it's not a pretty picture. And it's useful, it seems to me, that we start to have a proper discussion about this, and that the relevant professional bodies like the British Psychological Society need to have a proper debate about this and start to tighten up the whole question of ethics in relation to this particular study and in relation to a whole range of other ethical questions, such as, in particular, collaboration with the security and intelligence services. Thank you.
Thank you.